All right, so we're going to be looking at the anterior shoulder this week. So we have the skeleton here. Just want you to see something because shoulder structure, shoulder function gets pretty complicated, especially when we look at all the different things we can really consider. So the one thing we want to notice about, because anterior shoulder, posterior shoulder, when we look at doing strength training exercises for this joint, the big thing we have to consider is where this joint really makes contact with the skeleton. So if I were to draw a circle right here at the center, and I'm going to go ahead and take my slicing tool off, but we look at what is obviously your collarbone right there. It really connects to the top of the sternum right there. Now, when we look at the shoulder as a whole, and we look at the shoulder blade, I want you to start to notice something. Look at the space between the rib cage and the shoulder blade, and then we start to understand upper arm attaches to shoulder blade. We have your humerus there, and basically what happens when we look at the whole shoulder complex and the shoulder girdle is that it's really only attached here. Oh, sorry, missed that, wrong scap. That's still hitting the scap, but we're really attached to the sternum via the clavicle or your collarbone. So when we look at training the shoulder, both anterior and posterior, we need to understand really what's going on is that we have a very, very mobile joint because it's only attached to the skeleton at one joint, bone to bone. Okay, so let's go ahead, let's add the musculature in here because it's really important to understand how complex this whole shoulder gets. Okay. And we're going to take away our neck here real quick. So if we take away some of the neck musculature, when we look at the anterior shoulder, we're going to have a couple big players. We have our pec major right there in the front. That's one of the most visible muscles of the shoulder that we can see, along with the deltoid, which is out on the outside. So when we look at really shoulder flexion, shoulder or humeral internal rotation, we're looking at those pecs. Abduction, so basically raising your arm out to the side, we're looking at that deltoid. Being able to understand how big these muscles are, but then even how they're holding the shoulder in place. If I cut the deltoid away here, all of a sudden we start to see, we uncover a good bit of musculature. Now the deltoid, a lot of times we see it in a big space, or it's very visible. People have those rounded off shoulders. There's so many different muscles that play into stabilizing that humerus there. So it's not part of the rotator cuff. Sometimes people mistake that for being part of the rotator cuff. We'll look more at the rotator cuff when we talk about the posterior shoulder. But that deltoid, I'm going to put that back on there. So the deltoid has so many, because it's so round and where it attaches, we can kind of see it from the side here. It's going to perform a lot of different movements based on the way the muscle fibers line up. So they all kind of line up in a triangle. So when we look at the anterior shoulder, we're going to notice that it takes some of the brunt of the load on the front, depending on the movement. We look at the posterior shoulder, it'll do the same thing. We're going to go ahead and get rid of it again, because when we look at the pec, a lot of times we look at this line of pull, so basically the way that the muscle fibers orient themselves. And so it's going to do a lot more internal rotation of the humerus at the shoulder than it's going to do shoulder flexion. And we can cut this away and we start to see even more how this stabilizes. So this is your pec minor right here. And when we really look at stabilizing the shoulder, so this is attached to your acromion process, or really it's more the spine, your acromion process up here, sorry. But basically the top spine of your scapula there. So what that's doing as your shoulder blade moves up overhead, or your arm moves overhead, it's stabilizing your shoulder and bringing that shoulder blade forward. So when we look at push-ups, when we look at bench presses, when we look at dumbbell bench presses, that's one of those muscles that's doing a whole lot. The other thing we have to think about here, with the anterior shoulder is the biceps. And a lot of people think, oh, biceps are your arms. But your biceps, there's basically 3 muscles that make up the bicep. They're coracobrachialis, people tend to forget about. But then you have your short head and your long head. So you have a short head here on the outside, and then you have the long head here on the inside. Those basically stabilize the shoulder. Like we can see right here where the long head connects. It's the same spot where the pec minor connects. So when we look at anything really in the pressing movements, having a solid foundation for the bicep, when we look at any, like I said, push-up, bench press, dumbbell bench press, overhead shoulder press, being able to have strong biceps plays into some of that function of the shoulder. Okay. Obviously, you can see these are all very, very complex. We can also look here, and if we really want to, your trap kind of comes into the front of the shoulder a little bit, but it doesn't play as much as it does the back side of the shoulder. We can look into some of the neck musculature, so your sternocleidomastoid. A lot of times it uses the clavicle really more for head and neck function, so basically rotating your head. But it does do some work stabilizing that collarbone to be able to move the shoulder throughout. Okay. Now, the one thing that's going to get a little interesting is that a lot of times when we look at the shoulder, the elbow acts kind of in an extension when we do a lot of our anterior shoulder movements. So the triceps and the anterior shoulder, mainly the pec minor and the pec major, the triceps tend to do a lot of work on those movements because they're also going through elbow extension. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more in class. The other thing that we have to think about here on the anterior shoulder is this muscle right here, which is the serratus anterior. So if you've ever seen anybody with fish gills, if they would take their shirt off and it looks like they got fish gills underneath their armpit, that's the serratus anterior. So I'm going to cut away some of these things here. I'm going to take away, there we go. So basically took away everything. That serratus anterior comes in, and you start to see where it looks at the shoulder blade. So anytime we look at the anterior shoulder, the job of the serratus anterior is basically to pull that shoulder blade forward and stabilize the back side of your shoulder blade so then it can move forward in conjunction with the pec minor and the pec major. So those are really our big players that we're going to look at, being able to understand how do we create stable shoulders. It's a very, very complex joint, so that's why we're spending 2 weeks on it, but being able to understand how these all play a factor, one, in creating strong shoulders, and then also healthy shoulders to be able to get the most out of them. So there's just a brief overview, just so you can kind of see what's going on. We'll talk in class more about extension, flexion, internal and external rotation, abduction and adduction, and then we'll go through our major, more pressing movements with the anterior shoulder.